Hello, my name is Megan Woods, and this is my final project for Analytic Techniques. I have chosen a piece entitled Stay Alive for Me, which I will discuss more in future slides, and I hope you enjoy. The agenda for my presentation will be as follows. First, I created a descriptive map over the piece, which I will go over. Then I completed a conceptual integration network. And then at the very end, I will give my final thoughts and close out the presentation. Stay Alive for Me is a piece written by composer Arner Chu. He originally tried to write it as a marimba solo. However, eventually he expanded it for two marimbas, specifically two 4 1/3 octave marimbas. This was Chu's first piece to ever compose, and he completed the piece when he was just a sophomore in high school. It was written in 2018. I found the piece on Spotify, actually, and when I listened to it the first time, I actually thought it was a piece for solo marimba, and I thought it was a really difficult piece. However, upon further research, I discovered that it was a marimba duet, and it is actually one of the pieces that I am currently learning right now. Before I get into the actual descriptive map itself, I wanted to go over my identification of terms. So I chose to examine 3 elements in my map. The first being texture, which describes which part or parts are playing, comprised of M1, M2, T, and R. M1 indicates that the marimba 1 part is the only one playing, and likewise M2 indicates that the marimba 2 part is the only one playing. T stands for tutti, which means both parts are playing together, and R indicates a measure of rest in which neither parts are playing. The second element I analyzed were the instances of cadences, which happened when the music naturally approaches the end of a major section. I chose to notate that with the letter X, simply indicating the presence of a cadence. Finally, the last element that I examined was tempo, which I chose to mean any markings including accelerando, retardando, and the letter F, which influence the tempo. The letter F delineates a fermata, and DQ stands for dotted quarter note. Several benefits exist to using descriptive maps. I'm going to go over 3 today. The first benefit is that the descriptive map allows for the visualization of the use of elements in their relation to one another that might not be so easily seen if one were simply looking at the score alone. So being able to look at these elements within a chart and seeing how they relate to one another is one of the major benefits of the descriptive map. The second benefit is that it exists as an analysis outside of the traditional form and/or harmonic analysis. And finally, the descriptive map can provide a greater understanding of the piece as both the listener and the performer. In terms of the development of elements, I have a few interesting findings that I like to point out. First of all, within the texture, the 2 marimba parts seem to be having a conversation with one another throughout the entire duration of the piece. It's almost as if there's a distinct pattern of the marimba 1 part happening, then a tutti section, then the marimba 2 part happening, so on and so forth. Also, the cadence and the tempo develop almost in direct relation to one another. For example, if you look across the cadence rows, you'll see that almost every single time that there's an X, it is almost always surrounded by some change in the tempo, either before, after, or both. This is interesting because it sort of separates the piece into different segments, and then within those segments, it's almost as if the texture and the tempo and cadence are having their own interactions with one another. As far as my interpretation goes, I think it's only natural that the cadence and the tempo be so directly related, because they help to differentiate the various segments of the piece. Unfortunately, I have elected not to include an entire recording of the piece within my presentation itself. However, I will be sure to include links to both the score and the recording so that you can experience it yourself. I also think it's very appropriate that the two marimba parts interact so frequently with one another. I believe that this piece is about a conversation, and within the piece there are several conversations going on. There's one between the two marimba parts. There's another one between the tempo and the cadence. And then there's a third conversation going on between the texture and then the cadence and the tempo. And I think they can represent different things, from reasons for someone to stay alive, or people that someone should stay alive for. Other things like that would be very appropriate, I believe. Later on in the presentation, I'll include a statement from Chu himself about his sort of interpretation of the piece. That was a really quick run through of my interpretation of my descriptive map that I created over the piece. And now I would like to move on to the second form in which I analyzed the piece, which is the use of the conceptual integration network. This piece is 103 measures long, and it's roughly 4 minutes in duration. Within the piece, I elected to focus on measures 82 through 89 within the second marimba part. There is a segment in which the marimba 2 part takes over and has this moving line, and it gets slower and slower and slower, and this is what I chose to use as my input M for my conceptual integration network. When I first started working on this project, I had no intentions upon completing a conceptual integration network for the piece. In fact, I had chosen a different way to analyze my music other than that. I just so happened to do a quick Google search to see if I could find any sort of artwork that would interact well with the piece I've chosen. And funny enough, somehow I stumbled upon this acrylic painting entitled Stay Alive for Me. It was completed by Roger Brackens in March 2022, which was 4 years after my piece was composed. So it's not a typical conceptual integration network relationship. However, I do believe that after examining both of these works, that I have been able to come up with a deeper understanding and a new meaning out of the relationship between the two works. On the next slide, you will hear the input M, the marimba 2 part, for those couple of measures, and you will also see the painting side by side one another. You'll also hear the marimba 2 part being played. And then I will go into explaining my conceptual integration network just a bit further. As I stated earlier, my input space M was the moving line in the marimba 2 part, measures 82 through 89. Skipping over the generic space for now, the input space P that I chose to focus on were the light blue drips running down the painting. There were several of those, and as I listened to this segment of the piece, that is what drew my attention. The generic space I came up with was the metaphor for longing, desperation, and sadness. So putting all of that together, my blended space says, the moving line in the marimba 2 part measures 82 through 89 represent the painting's implied longing, desperation, and sadness through the light blue drips. This is an example of a contextual relationship because new meanings were created as a result of the interaction between these two works. And without this interaction, the meaning may not have ever been created. I reached out to composer Chu and I asked him several questions, one of which was in regards to his interpretation of the piece. And this is probably the most profound quote that he said to me. He said, and I quote, "I believe everyone who performs this piece should find what it represents for them and let that meaning lead their interpretation. For someone who's learning the piece for the first time, I would encourage them to find their own message or meaning and embody that in their interpretation so that they can breathe their own life into the music. Instead of looking outside for someone to tell them how to play it, I would much rather they look to their own imagination or experiences." So at first glance, one might think that Chu would be highly against us using the conceptual integration network. However, if you go a little bit deeper, I think it's obvious that he would actually be a proponent of the idea, because out of it, we were able to create our own message, our own meaning, which is exactly what he's saying here in this quote. To close this out, I am really grateful that I was able to select a piece of my own choosing to complete this project over. I think having a personal connection to this piece in that I'm learning it myself made it more meaningful for me. And I do believe that after completing this project, I have a deeper understanding of the piece, which will hopefully in turn result in a better performance later on. I'm really grateful that I was able to learn throughout the duration of this course about the different ways that we can look at music outside of just the traditional form and harmonic analysis. And I believe that out of my graduate studies, this is one of the courses that I have really gained the most insight out of. I'm really grateful for that, and I've really enjoyed taking this course. So that's all I've got on my descriptive map and conceptual integration network for the piece Stay Alive for Me. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and thank you so much for watching.